I was sitting in a hospital hallway when my dad leaned down and whispered something I'll never forget. "Don't tell anyone you re-mine." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, people rushed past us, and I was 22 years old, holding an ice pack against my swollen wrist, trying to understand why the man who drove me here was now pretending I didn't exist. He didn't say it with anger. That's what made it worse. He said it quietly, almost casually. But what he was really saying was, "You're an embarrassment, and I need you to disappear." We'd ended up at the hospital because I'd fallen off a ladder while helping him clean. Got us that afternoon. He'd called me that morning and asked if I could come by, and like always, I said yes immediately, hoping this time might be different. I drove 40 minutes to get there and spent 3 hours on that ladder while he stood below, giving instructions. Barely looking up, never once asking if I needed water or a break. When I fell, my foot slipped on a wet rung, and I landed hard with my wrist taking most of the impact. And his first words weren't, "Are you okay?" They were, "Can you move?" Because he was assessing damage, not checking on me. The whole ride to the ER he kept saying, "It's probably nothing. You don't need to make a big deal out of this." And I understood what he meant. Do you embarrass me? Do you exist louder than I am comfortable with? Our relationship had always been distant, transactional, built on the unspoken rule that I was supposed to earn his attention by being perfect, helpful, and forgettable all at once. When we got to the hospital, he walked 3 steps ahead of me the entire way inside, like we weren't together, like he just happened to be heading in the same direction as some random injured guy. At the check-in desk, the nurse asked if he was with me, and before I could answer, he said, just dropping him off, even though he'd told me he'd wait, and I felt something inside me crack. But the nurse said they'd need his information since I'd listed him as my emergency contact, and I saw his jaw tighten, that familiar flash of irritation that said I'd done something wrong again. We sat down in the waiting area, him on one end of a row of plastic chairs, me on the other, a deliberate gap between us that might as well have been a canyon. A woman sat down near us, with her teenage son who had a bloody towel wrapped around his hand, and she kept touching his shoulder, saying, "You're okay. We're gonna get you fixed up." And I watched them with this aching feeling because that's what parents were supposed to do. That's when my dad leaned over and whispered those words, "Don't tell anyone you re-mine." And then he sat back, pulled out his phone, and started scrolling like he'd just commented on the weather. My wrist was throbbing, but nothing hurt worse than sitting there knowing my own father was ashamed of me for reasons I couldn't even name. Finally, a nurse called my name, and they took us to a small examination room, where the nurse checked my vitals, then said the doctor would be in soon, leaving us alone in that tiny, suffocating space. I tried one more time. I said, "Thanks for bringing me. I know you're busy." And he just nodded and said yep without looking up, and that's when I realized I'd been apologizing my entire life for existing. The door opened and a doctor walked in, a man maybe in his 50s with kind eyes and silver hair, and he started asking me questions about the fall while examining my wrist gently. The doctor said he wanted to get an x-ray just to be safe, and then he glanced at my chart, looked up at my dad, and asked in a perfectly casual tone, "Are you listed as his emergency contact? Or are you his father?" The room went completely still. It wasn't an accusatory question, just a simple clarification, but the silence that followed was so thick I could have drowned in it. My dad opened his mouth, closed it, looked at me for the first time since we'd entered the room, and I saw something flicker across his face. Panic, maybe, or calculation. I didn't say anything. Didn't help him, because I was so tired of carrying the weight of his shame, and I wanted to see what he'd do when I stopped trying to save him from himself. Finally, he said, "I'm his father," and his voice was different, smaller somehow, like admitting it out loud in front of someone else had cost him something he was unprepared to pay. The doctor nodded and said, "Okay, good. I always like to know who I'm talking to," and there was something in his tone that suggested he'd noticed more than he was saying. The doctor turned back to me and said, "So this happened while you were helping with home maintenance?" And when I confirmed, he said that's generous of you. Not everyone takes time out of their day to help family with projects like that. Then he asked, "How long were you up on that ladder before the fall?" And when I told him 3 hours, maybe longer, his eyebrows went up and he said, 3 hours. That's a long time. Were you taking breaks? And I shook my head. The doctor glanced at my dad and said, "Well, It is good he has someone looking out for him, made sure he got to the hospital right away, and it should have been a compliment, but somehow it sounded like a question. My dad said of course, but his voice was tight, defensive, and the doctor just nodded slowly and said, "That's what matters, being there when family needs you." Then the doctor pulled up a chair and sat down, and he looked at me and asked, "When you fell? How long did it take for someone to help you? Did your dad see it happen?" I told the truth, said I'd been on the ground maybe a minute or two before my dad came over, that he'd been inside getting a drink, and the doctor nodded thoughtfully. The doctor looked at my dad now, directly respectfully, but there was steel underneath. I ask because sometimes people minimize pain because they do unwant to be a burden, and it's really important that the people around them take it seriously. My dad said, "I brought him here, didn't I?" sounding defensive, and the doctor said, "You did." "Absolutely, I am just making sure he knows he is allowed to speak up when he is hurt." Then he turned back to me, voice softer. "You do have two tough things out to prove anything to anyone. If something hurts, you say so. If you need help, you ask. That's not weakness. That's wisdom." I felt something break open inside my chest, something I'd been holding closed for years, and I nodded because I didn't trust my voice, and the doctor patted my knee and said, "Good man." He stood up and looked at my dad one more time. "I see a lot of families come through here, and the ones that do best are the ones where people feel safe asking for help. Just something to think about." He left, and my dad and I sat there in the aftermath. And I could tell he was angry, could see it in the way he was gripping his phone, but he didn't say anything. Finally, he said that doctor was out of line, and I looked at him, really looked at him, and said no, he wasn't. It was the first time I'd ever contradicted him directly, and I watched his face cycle through surprise, anger, and something else I couldn't name. He said, "I brought you here. I waited with you. What more do you want from me?" And I realized he genuinely didn't understand, genuinely thought that showing up was the same thing as caring. I said I don't want anything, and I meant it in a way that felt like freedom. I didn't want anything from him anymore because I'd finally understood I was never going to get it. And that wasn't my fault. A technician came for x-rays, and when I got back to the examination room 20 minutes later, he wasn't there. A nurse told me he'd gone to move his car, and I knew he probably wasn't coming back. The doctor came back with results and noticed I was alone, and he explained it was a bad sprain, not a fracture, that I'd need a brace for a few weeks and should take it easy. He paused and said, "You have someone at home who can help you out." And I said, I'd be fine. And he studied me and said, "Being independent is good, but it's also okay to let people take care of you. Sometimes you deserve that." He gave me his card and said, "If you need anything, you call." And I said, "Thank you," meaning it for more than just the medical care, meaning it for seeing me, for saying things no one had ever said to me before. I checked my phone, and there was a text from my dad. "Doctor said you're fine. Had to get back for a call. Can you get yourself home?" And I stared at that message for a long time, at the casual cruelty of it. I texted back, "Yeah," then called a rideshare and went outside to wait, watching other families come and go, people helping each other, holding hands, being present. My ride arrived, and the driver asked, "Rough day?" looking at my brace. And I said, "Yeah, kind of." And he said, "Well, you made it through. That counts for something." I looked out the window as we pulled away, and I thought about what the doctor had said. You deserve to be taken care of. You don't have two tough things out to prove anything. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn my father's approval, and it had never worked, because the problem wasn't me. It had never been me. Over the next few days I didn't hear from my dad. No text asking how I was healing, no call checking if I needed anything, and for the first time that silence did unfeel like abandonment. It felt like clarity. I kept the doctor's card on my refrigerator, and sometimes I'd look at it and remember. The ones that do best are the ones where people feel safe asking for help. 2 weeks later, my dad finally called, asking if my wrist was better, then said, "I'm having some people over next month. Could use help setting up. You free?" I felt the old programming kick in, the automatic yes that had defined our relationship. But I thought about the doctor, about being allowed to speak up, and I said, "I don't think so." "Dad!" He was quiet, then said, "Oh, okay. No problem," sounding surprised, maybe hurt, but I didn't take it back. I said, "I hope it goes well, though." And we hung up. He didn't call after that, and I understood this was how it would be. Now I'd chosen dignity over acceptance, and he'd chosen distance over change. My wrist healed slowly, and I went to physical therapy twice a week, learning that healing isn't linear, that sometimes things get worse before they get better. I started building different relationships, friendships where I didn't have to minimize myself to be accepted, where I could ask for help without shame, where my presence was wanted, not just tolerated. I learned that family isn't just blood. It's the people who show up, who see you, who create space for you to exist without apology. Sometimes I'd pass a hospital and remember that day, remember sitting in that hallway, hearing, "Don't tell anyone you're mine." Remember the doctor asking his careful questions. Remember the moment everything shifted. I didn't leave that hospital with an apology from my father, didn't leave with reconciliation or any of the things I'd spent years hoping for. But I left with something better. The certainty that I didn't deserve to be hidden, that my existence wasn't something to be ashamed of, that I was worth more than crumbs of affection. And in the end, that certainty saved me in ways my father never could, because it taught me the most important lesson. You do need someone else's approval to know your own worth. My wrist still aches, sometimes when it rains, a permanent reminder of that day. But I don't mind it anymore. It's a scar that tells a story, not of falling, but of getting back up. I keep his card on my refrigerator still, not because I need a doctor, but because I need the reminder. You deserve to be taken care of. You're allowed to ask for help. You don't have to earn love by disappearing. That day in the hospital, my father tried to erase me, but someone else chose to see me instead. And that made all the difference.